Entry-level cameras are now better than ever, but a good entry-level camera is very specialized because each camera has specific features, specs, and design for different styles of shooting. And trying to find the right entry-level camera for your style of shooting can be pretty confusing. So in this video, we're looking at the best entry-level cameras for different styles of shooting and what features you actually need depending on your shooting style. Also, I'll leave links down below for the best pricing on all the cameras we talk about today. So the first entry-level camera on this list is probably the easiest camera to use because it has the exact features you need to get amazing photos and videos even if you're just starting out and you don't know much about cameras. And that is the Canon R50. But this is just the first camera on this list, and we have other cameras later in this list that are better for video shooters or if you're somewhat of a hybrid shooter. Now, what makes the Canon R50 such a great camera is how easy it is to use in terms of design and the user experience. It's a very small and compact camera that literally fits in the palm of your hand, but it still has a solid grip and a button layout that is very well thought out, and it's a really easy camera to navigate. On top of that, it has a mode known as Intelligent Auto. This is simply where you tell the camera what you want in terms of brightness, color, contrast, even how much background blur you want, and the camera will make all the complex settings for you. This way, you can get the exact look for your photos and videos without having to know the technical side of how to use a camera. Plus, it also has a side articulating screen for filming yourself along with high angle and low angle shots, and the screen on the back is also touch sensitive, allowing you to change all of your major settings including the menu along with things like shutter, ISO, and aperture just using the screen on the back. Plus, the screen on the back also allows for touch autofocus, and the autofocusing system in the R50 itself is really good. It has AI-based tracking that can automatically detect subjects like human, animals, and cars, and it makes the autofocusing system just that much more reliable if you're someone that's just starting out. And autofocusing can be one of the most frustrating things about getting a new camera, but this is going to fix all of those issues. And the R50 also has an electronic viewfinder that is much higher quality than most viewfinders in an entry-level camera. It's high quality with high resolution and smooth motion, and when you're tracking subjects with the electronic viewfinder, there doesn't seem to be any sort of lag. And the R50 also has a pretty decent internal microphone for vlogging, but I do recommend using an external microphone if you really want the best audio. And despite the R50 being such a small camera, it actually has pretty solid battery life. You'll get at least an hour to an hour and a half of video with non-stop use and several hundred photos with a single charge of that battery. In terms of technology, the R50 has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which is a pretty respectable amount of resolution that can capture a lot of detail, and it's enough resolution for cropping and editing your photos. Now, the one really cool thing about the sensor is that the internal colors with this camera are really great. Everything looks very true to life, but it's still very warm and vibrant, and if you're someone that's just starting out and you don't know how to edit your photos and videos yet, you're going to get really great colors that almost don't need to be edited. Now, in terms of shooting photos, it can shoot anywhere between 12 to 15 frames per second with a pretty decent frame buffer of 28 to 48 JPEGs in a row, which is more than fast enough for casual action, even with a little bit of sports thrown in there. But the one problem with the R50 is that regardless of your frame rate, it's only going to shoot 7 raw photos in a row. And if you're someone that really likes to edit their photos, you're going to want to shoot raw. And this is probably not the camera for someone that wants to shoot action and you also want to shoot raw. But if you're shooting slow-moving stuff like landscapes, portraits, this camera will be more than fine enough. However, if you're someone that wants to shoot raw photos and shoot action at the same time, there is a camera later in this list that might be perfect for you. Now, in terms of video, this is where the Canon R50 really shines. It shoots 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second, but the 4K is also downsampled from 6K, giving you 6K detail in a much smaller 4K file. On top of that, the R50 can also shoot 10-bit color when shooting in HDR PQ mode. This is going to give you a slightly flatter image that's going to give you more flexibility over color grading and also over the light values. If you're someone that wants to really create a cinematic look or just a unique look to your videos, this is a feature that you absolutely need. And this is also one of the best cameras for that type of filmmaking. And the Canon R50 can also shoot full HD at 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion and 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion. Plus, the R50 also has digital stabilization for smooth handheld video. If you're someone that's going to be vlogging or just running and gunning with this camera, this is a feature you're going to find very useful. The Canon R50 is one of the newest and best entry-level cameras out there right now. It's a great fit for someone who's looking to shoot casual photos and videos, but also for someone that wants to do something a little bit more serious as well. The only downside of the Canon R50 is that it might not be a good fit for someone that wants to shoot action while also shooting in RAW. But I think the main selling point of the Canon R50 is how simple and easy it is to use, and it's a great fit for someone who just wants to shoot photos and videos for fun. But if you're a little bit more serious with your photos and videos, maybe you're a YouTuber, a vlogger, or an online content creator, there's actually a camera that was specifically designed with your style of shooting in mind, and that is the Sony ZV-E10. The design of this camera is ultra compact as you would expect, but there is no viewfinder and flash to keep the size down. But personally, I don't really mind the lack of these features considering who this camera is for, and you'll see later on that there's features in this camera that more than make up for it. And one thing I love about the ZV-10 is the very unique button layout. It has one button to go between photos, video, and slow motion, so there's no messy mode dial, and it's really easy to switch between different modes on this camera. Plus, there's a separate record button for video and a separate button for taking photos. Now, instead of giving you a flash or electronic viewfinder, the ZV-10 actually has a shockingly crisp microphone built right into the camera that's going to give you really good audio even in busy locations. And not only does this microphone sound really good, but it's going to save you money by not having to buy another microphone, and it's also going to keep the size of your camera much smaller for vloggers especially by not having to add a bulky microphone on top of your camera. And the ZV-10 also has a side articulating screen, however there is no touch functionality except for touch autofocus. And the autofocus in the ZV-10 is super solid. It's not AI-based tracking like the Canon R50, but it's still a very reliable and sticky autofocusing system. And that's mainly because the Sony autofocusing system as a whole is miles ahead of the rest of the industry. So even with an older camera like the ZV-E10, you're going to get 10 out of 10 autofocus. And considering how small this camera is, naturally it's going to have a pretty small battery, but you're still going to get pretty decent recording times for both photos and videos. However, I would recommend having at least one spare battery if you're going to be out and about with this camera. But on a positive note, you can charge this camera via USB-C and power it as well. So if you're sitting down and doing talking head recording like this, you can simply plug this in via the USB and just power it like that. Now, in terms of technology, the Sony ZV-E10 has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which is pretty similar to the Canon R50. But the ZV-E10 is significantly better in low light performance. And with this, you're going to get a camera that's really good specifically for nighttime shooters. So if you're vlogging at night, taking photos at night, you're going to get really clean results even at high ISOs. And I think this specifically makes up for that lack of flash. However, some of you guys may still want a flash simply because you like the look of it. And for you guys, I do have a little hack for you later in this section. Now, in terms of taking photos, the ZV-E10 is an absolute beast of a camera. It can shoot 10 frames per second, which is slightly slower than the Canon R50, but it can actually shoot 166 JPEGs in a row and 44 RAW photos in a row, which is almost triple the amount of photos the Canon R50 can take. It does a way better job for someone who's a serious shooter that also wants to shoot action while also shooting in RAW photos. And the ZV-E10 overall can just simply shoot for longer without needing a break. The video in the ZV-E10 is also really impressive. It shoots 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second that is also downsampled from 6K. So it's going to give you 6K detail, but in a smaller 4K file. However, there is no 10-bit color option in the ZV-E10, but the ZV-E10 does come with S-Log3 and cinema profiles, which is arguably more important when it comes to color grading and getting a cinematic look from your camera. It's really going to depend on how you like to color grade your video, but personally I would rather have cinema profiles in my camera than 10-bit color. And it can also shoot full HD at 60 and 120 frames per second for really nice slow motion. The ZV-E10 also has digital stabilization for handheld vlogging and handheld shooting. However, in my opinion, the ZV-E10 does a much better job with digital stabilization than the Canon R50 does, and it might be a better fit for people that are doing run and gun shooting. Now, if you love the specs of the ZV-E10, but you simply wish it had a more traditional mirrorless body with a flash and electronic viewfinder, there's also the Sony a6100 to consider. The only thing that it's missing is that it doesn't have cinema profiles for video, but it's a pretty worthy trade if you want flash and electronic viewfinder. And the LCD screen on the back only tilts up and down, and it flips up to the top if you want to see yourself. Now, this LCD screen at the top does cause problems if you want a microphone at the top of your camera, so keep that in mind. Either way, if you're a content creator or someone that's just shooting for fun and you want a camera with some serious horsepower, but also with design features specifically made for people that are shooting for social media and online content creation. Both the ZV-E10 and the Sony a6100 are phenomenal cameras that are absolutely worth the price. And both of these cameras are much better for photographers that want to shoot raw photos while also shooting action. And I love the fact that the ZV-E10 has cinema profiles built into this camera that's going to give you a lot more flexibility with your video when it comes to editing. Now, when it comes to entry-level cameras, the one complaint I always hear from you guys is the design. The cameras are often too small, or there's too many corners being cut when it comes to design, and you miss the robust feeling of a proper big boy camera in your hands. And just because you have an entry-level camera doesn't mean you have to sacrifice on design. And for you guys, I have not one, but two cameras, and that is the Nikon Z30 and the Nikon Z50. The two cameras are pretty similar in terms of specs, but have very different designs depending on if you want to shoot photos or video. But with both cameras, you have an ultra premium design with a really satisfying, almost DSLR-like feel in your hands. And the grip is fantastic. All the buttons and menus are really well laid out, and it really has a premium feel to everything on this camera. It's kind of like getting your hands on the Mercedes-Benz of an entry-level camera. The Z50 has an electronic viewfinder. On top of that, it also has a built-in flash, which I think a lot of entry-level shooters will appreciate. And the screen on the back is a tilt screen with touch autofocus. However, one thing to note is that for this screen, if you want to see yourself, it actually flips up to the bottom, which is pretty great for vlogs, but it does become a problem if you want to use this camera with a tripod. The Z30 has no electronic viewfinder to keep it smaller, but without the electronic viewfinder, it also does not have a flash. Instead, similar to the ZV-E10, it actually has a dual microphone at the top of the camera, which gives you shockingly good audio. And while it's not quite as good as the ZV-E10, it's still very, very close. And if you're someone that's planning on using this as a dedicated video camera or a vlogging camera, this is a super solid option. And I do think the design of this camera is much better than the ZV-E10 when it just comes to the feel of the camera in your hands. And the Z30 also has a dedicated button to switch between photo and video mode quickly. And one really big positive that both cameras have is the kit lens that these cameras come with. This is way better than any entry-level lens really should be. And this lens also has stabilization built right into the lens. This is going to give you smooth handheld video, but it's also going to help reduce any sort of shake when taking photos at a slow shutter speed. And the battery life on both cameras is very solid. It's going to give you several hours of runtime shooting on and off as a hobbyist camera. It's probably going to give you about 40 minutes of video and several hundred photos. And this camera can be both powered and charged via the USB-C port. Inside both cameras, you'll find a 20.9 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which is slightly lower than the 24 megapixel sensor, but it does have some benefits by having a lower resolution. By having a lower resolution, both of these cameras are shockingly good in low light. Vlogging at nighttime, taking photos at nighttime, you're going to get very clean results. And for the most part, you're really not going to notice that 4 megapixels of resolution when it comes to cropping or editing your photos. Both cameras can also shoot at 11 frames per second with 100 JPEGs in a row before this camera needs a break. And when it comes to raw shooting, you can shoot at 9 frames per second with up to 30 raw photos in a row, which is pretty much good enough for any kind of entry-level shooting, whether it's action, sports, landscapes, lifestyle shooting. This camera will do it all when it comes to photos. And when it comes to video, it shoots 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second, but because of that lower megapixel resolution, there's zero rolling shutter or wobble that you see on most mirrorless cameras. And it does deliver 4K, but it's only native 4K. The video in the Nikon Z30 and Z50 is not downsampled like the ZV-E10 or the R50, so it really depends on what you want this camera for. For a lot of people, downsampling may not be that big of a deal. For some people, it might be. And both cameras can also shoot at 60 and 120 frames per second in full HD for slow motion. Now, one thing to note is that there are no cinema profiles in either of these cameras, but there are creative filters built into the cameras that do add a unique look to your photos and videos. Plus, both of these cameras also have digital stabilization for smooth handheld video, and this digital stabilization paired with the stabilization that's also in the lens, it's probably going to give you the smoothest handheld video out of any of the cameras on this list. One thing to mention is the autofocus. In my opinion, the autofocus is about an 8.5 out of 10, with Canon and Sony being an absolute 10. The autofocus is a little bit slower when it comes to tracking, and it doesn't have any sort of AI-based autofocus. But for the most part, for most entry-level shooters, the autofocus is going to be just fine. And it also has face and eye detect, so if you're vlogging or shooting people, the autofocus is going to do just fine, and you probably won't even notice the difference. The main reason to get the Nikon Z30 or the Z50 is really that premium design. and of course that lens. Both cameras look and handle in a way that a big boy camera really should. It's going to give you phenomenal photos and videos with really premium design. And if you're someone that's really serious about your photography or your video shooting and you want a proper big boy camera, but you still want it to come at an entry-level price, both of these cameras are phenomenal options. And if you want to make sure you get both of these cameras at the best price possible, make sure to check out the links in the description down below, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.